In 2026, a company in China ordered billions of dollars worth of AI chips. The shocking part is that none of them came from Nvidia. For years, Nvidia controlled about 95% of the AI chip market in China. Now, Nvidia's own finance chief says they are shipping 0 of their most advanced chips into the country this year. 0. A $50 billion market has essentially walked out the door and started building its own supply chain instead. This did not happen by accident. It happened because the United States spent years trying to stop China from ever making advanced chips at all. The plan was to keep China dependent on American technology. Instead, the restrictions forced an entire country to figure out how to build AI chips from scratch. If you are enjoying videos like this, please hit the like button because it takes a lot of effort to make these, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. What you are about to hear is the story of how a company that could not even buy basic parts a few years ago managed to build a chip good enough to make Silicon Valley nervous. To understand how China built its own AI chip industry, we have to go back to where this whole story started. A company built to survive. In 1987, a man named Ren Zhengfei started a small trading company in Shenzhen, China. He did not have billions of dollars. He had the equivalent of a few $1,000s. Ren grew up poor in rural China. He was one of 7 children in a family that sometimes did not have enough food to go around. Before starting his company, he worked as a military engineer, building systems and learning how to solve problems with very limited resources. He has said openly that he did not start the business because he had a grand dream or a vision for changing the world. He started it because he needed to survive. He needed to feed his family. That company was Huawei. For decades, Huawei grew quietly. They built phone networks for rural areas that bigger companies ignored. They worked on infrastructure projects that seemed unglamorous at the time, but gave them deep experience in telecommunications. Eventually, they moved into smartphones, and by 2019, Huawei had become the second largest smartphone maker on the entire planet, right behind Apple. They were selling phones in over 170 countries. They were a massive success story that most people in the West had never heard of until it was too late to ignore them. But then everything changed. The United States government decided Huawei was a national security threat. Washington blocked Huawei from buying American chips. They blocked Huawei from using American chip-making software. They pressured allies around the world to stop doing business with the company. A year later, the world's most important chip factory, TSMC in Taiwan, was forced to stop supplying Huawei entirely. Almost overnight, the company that had beaten Apple in phone sales could not get the parts to build a phone. Imagine running a busy restaurant that suddenly cannot buy a stove, a fridge, or even basic ingredients. The restaurant owner is told to keep serving customers anyway. That was Huawei's reality in 2020. Their supply chains collapsed overnight. Suppliers who had worked with them for years suddenly cut ties. Most people watching the industry thought the sanctions would be the end of the company. Some analysts publicly predicted Huawei would not survive more than a few years. But Ren later said this crisis was still easier than the poverty he survived as a child. He had faced worse odds before. Even so, he admitted the company's future was not guaranteed. He told employees years later, in a moment of surprising honesty, that even now the company could not say for certain it had secured its survival. So Huawei went to work. They quietly began redesigning thousands of circuit boards from scratch. They replaced over 13,000 band components with anything they could design or build in-house. They even built their own operating system after losing access to Google software. They built their own business software after losing access to foreign tools. Every time a door closed, they tried to build a new one themselves. This is the part of the story most people miss. The sanctions were not just an attack on Huawei. They were the spark that forced an entire country to build its own chip industry from scratch. One company led the charge out of pure necessity, and the whole country watched and learned from what they did. But to see how they actually built the chips, we need to look inside a secret division. The Secret Design Division. Inside Huawei sits a chip design division called HiSilicon. It was founded back in 2004, long before anyone imagined it would matter this much. Back then, it was just a small team working on basic chip designs for Huawei's networking equipment. Nobody outside the company paid much attention to it. After the sanctions hit, HiSilicon became the center of Huawei's survival plan. Their most important project became a line of AI chips called Ascend. Think of an AI chip the way you would think of a car engine. The bigger and more efficient the engine, the more work you can do at once. In the world of AI, that work means training massive systems. These are the systems that power chatbots, image generators, and self-driving software. The faster your engine runs, the faster your AI learns. For years, Nvidia built the best engines on the planet. Almost nobody else came close. Companies like Google and Amazon tried building their own chips, but Nvidia still dominated the market by a huge margin. They had spent over a decade perfecting their designs, and their software was so deeply embedded that switching to anything else felt almost impossible. Huawei's answer was the Ascend 910C. It was not their first attempt at an AI chip, but it was the one that mattered most. By 2025, the company was struggling to manufacture enough of them. Demand was high, but supply was limited. They needed to make more. Bloomberg reported that Huawei planned to roughly double 910C production in 2026. They were aiming for around 600,000 chips. Total Ascend output was climbing as high as 1.6 million dies across the whole product line. That is not a research project anymore. That is a full assembly line running around the clock, with factories churning out chips by the thousands every week. But there was a massive problem standing in their way. Making a chip design is one thing. You can draw the plans on a computer. You can simulate how it will perform. But actually manufacturing that chip is something completely different. The most advanced chip factories in the world use a specific kind of machine called an EUV lithography system. These machines are so precise, they can trace patterns on silicon that are smaller than a human hair is wide. Only one company on Earth makes these machines. It is a Dutch company called ASML, and each one costs well over $200 million. The United States has blocked ASML from selling its newest machines to China. Without that tool, most experts assumed China simply could not produce chips advanced enough to compete. It would be like trying to build a modern skyscraper with only hand tools. Everyone watching the industry thought Huawei was stuck. They had the designs, but no way to print them onto silicon. The whole world was about to find out if a country could build modern chips without the machines everyone said they needed. The workaround factory. China's largest chip factory is a company called SMIC. They refused to accept that China could not build advanced chips. While other companies gave up or waited for the sanctions to lift, SMIC's engineers went to work. Instead of the newest machines, they took older equipment that they were still allowed to buy. This equipment is called Deep Ultraviolet Lithography, or DUV for short. It is the generation before EUV, and it was considered too old for the kind of work Huawei needed. But the engineers at SMIC had an idea. They ran the same silicon wafer through the older machine multiple times using a technique called multiple patterning. Picture tracing over the same drawing several times with a slightly different stencil each pass. Each pass adds a little more detail. After enough passes, the fine detail finally appears. It sounds simple, but it is incredibly difficult to do in practice. Every pass has to line up perfectly with the last one. Even a tiny misalignment ruins the whole chip. It is slower, it is more expensive, and the yield, meaning how many working chips come out of each batch, is far lower than what factories in Taiwan or South Korea achieve. Industry estimates suggest SMIC's advanced chip yields land somewhere between 15 and 40%. The best factories elsewhere get well over 90%. That means more than half the chips SMIC makes on some runs end up in the trash. In a normal market, that would make the whole process pointless. But this was not a normal market. China was willing to lose money on every chip if it meant building a domestic supply chain that could not be cut off by foreign governments. By mid-2025, SMIC had used this method to produce working 5-nanometer chips for Huawei. They did it without a single EUV machine involved. It was expensive, it was inefficient, and it worked well enough to build the next generation of Ascend chips. A former vice president at TSMC, the very factory that once supplied Huawei, told Bloomberg it was simply not possible for the United States to completely prevent China from improving its chip technology. He said that when you push a country this hard, they find ways to adapt. China poured tens of billions of dollars into a national semiconductor fund to keep this workaround running. They treated a manufacturing shortcut as a matter of national priority rather than a temporary patch. The government built entire industrial parks around chip production. They offered tax breaks, subsidies, and grants to any company willing to invest in domestic semiconductor manufacturing. This workaround factory set the stage for the chip that actually shocked people watching this race closely. The older machines were never supposed to do this kind of work, but the engineers made it happen anyway, and what they built next would change the conversation entirely. The chip that shocked the world. In April 2026, Huawei unveiled its newest AI chip. It is called the Ascend 950 PR. They announced it at a partner event in Shenzhen, and the room was full of executives from China's biggest technology companies. On paper, the chip delivers roughly 1.5 petaflops of processing power. To put that in perspective, 1 petaflop means the chip can perform 1 quadrillion calculations per second. That is a 1 followed by 15 zeros. The chip also has over 100 gigabytes of high-speed memory attached, which means it can handle enormous amounts of data without slowing down. That puts it in the same conversation as some of Nvidia's most powerful chips, according to industry analysts who benchmarked it. It is important to be clear here. The new chip is not faster than Nvidia's absolute best hardware. Nobody serious claims that. If you put both chips in a head-to-head race, Nvidia still wins. Think of it less like a sports car overtaking a faster one on the highway. Think of it more like a reliable delivery van that never gets stuck at customs. It does not need to win the drag race. It just needs to show up every single time without anyone in Washington able to block the shipment. That is the part that makes it genuinely different from Nvidia's position, more than the raw specs on a slide. For a Chinese company building AI systems, having a chip that arrives on time is worth more than a chip that is slightly faster but might never ship at all. And that turned out to be enough for the biggest companies in China. Alibaba and Tencent placed major orders. ByteDance alone committed over $5.5 billion to Huawei chips for its data centers. Baidu is folding the chips into its own AI infrastructure. These are not small startups taking a gamble. These are some of the largest technology companies on the planet, and they are betting their future on a chip that did not exist a few years ago. Chris Miller, the historian who wrote the definitive book on the global chip war, said something powerful about this. He said ByteDance spending that kind of money on Huawei is not just a purchase. It is a statement that China's biggest AI companies are building their future on domestic silicon. By some estimates, Huawei's Ascend line is on track to capture roughly 60% of the AI chip market inside China by the end of 2026. Total revenue is projected past $12 billion. A sanctioned company using a workaround factory made a chip good enough that China's largest tech giants are betting billions on it instead of buying from Nvidia. But to understand what this means for the rest of the world, we need to look at what Nvidia is doing about it. Nvidia caught in the middle. For years, China was one of Nvidia's most important markets. It was not just a big customer. It was the fastest-growing market in the world for AI chips. Jensen Huang is Nvidia's chief executive officer. He has said the company once held about 95% market share there before export restrictions began cutting into it. That is an almost unheard-of level of dominance in any industry. Imagine owning 95% of a $50 billion market and then watching it shrink to zero. Nvidia tried to adapt. They built a stripped-down chip called the H20. It was specifically weakened so it could legally be sold into China under the US export rules. They took out some of the processing power and reduced the memory bandwidth. It was like selling a sports car with the engine limited to half its top speed. But it was still an Nvidia chip, and the software still worked. They still sold roughly 1 million of them in 2024 alone, which shows how much demand there was even for a weakened product. But the restrictions kept tightening. In 2026, Nvidia received approval to sell its more powerful H200 chip into China. Jensen Huang personally traveled to Beijing to help close the deal. At one point, he got mobbed by a crowd while trying to eat noodles on the street. People recognized him and wanted photos. It was a reminder of how much respect Nvidia still commanded in China, even as the political situation grew more complicated. But the chips still have not meaningfully shipped. Chinese regulators reportedly began discouraging domestic companies from relying on Nvidia hardware at all. They pushed them instead toward homegrown chips. At the same time, US rules restrict how those same chips can be used once they arrive. The result is a strange standoff. Both governments, for opposite reasons, are making it harder for Nvidia to sell into the world's second-largest economy. The Chinese government wants companies to buy domestic. The US government restricts what Nvidia can sell. Nvidia is squeezed from both sides. On a recent earnings call, Nvidia's own finance chief confirmed the company is now planning for 0 H20 shipments to China this year. 0. This is happening in a market Jensen Huang has called a $50 billion opportunity, growing as much as 50% a year. Nvidia is caught in the middle of two governments pulling in opposite directions. They still make the best chips in the world, but they cannot sell them to the one country that wants to buy the most of them. The door is closing, and it is forcing everyone to pick a side. A split world of technology. So does this actually mean the end of Nvidia? We need to be honest instead of dramatic here. The real picture is more interesting than a simple win or lose story. Outside of China, Nvidia remains the dominant force in AI computing by an enormous margin. They power nearly every major AI lab in the United States, Europe, and beyond. OpenAI uses Nvidia chips. Google uses them. Meta uses them. Amazon uses them. The list goes on and on. Analysts who track this space directly have said they do not expect an abrupt global switch away from Nvidia hardware. The software ecosystem built around Nvidia chips over the last 15 years is still deeply embedded almost everywhere outside China. Developers have spent years writing code that runs on Nvidia platforms. Switching to a different chip means rewriting that code, retraining models, and retraining engineers. That is not something that happens overnight. Even Ren Zhengfei himself admitted last year that China's individual chips still lag roughly one generation behind the best American hardware. He said it openly, without trying to spin it. But the country is closing the computing gap through raw scale and government-backed investment. Think of it less like China building a faster race car. Think of it more like China building enough slightly slower cars to fill every garage in the country while refusing to wait for a faster one to arrive. If you have 10,000 decent cars on the road, You can move a lot more cargo than 100 perfect cars sitting in a showroom. What has genuinely changed is not who makes the fastest chip on the planet. It is who China depends on to keep building its own AI industry. For the first time since the AI boom began, the world's second largest economy is training its most important AI systems largely on chips it designed and built inside its own borders. They are using a factory process nobody thought could work without machines they are not allowed to buy. This is the quiet end of a 20-year assumption that China would always be forced to buy someone else's engine to run its own future. For Nvidia, the challenge now is holding on to everywhere else, while a $50 billion market slips further out of reach every quarter. For the rest of the world, the real question stops being which chip is fastest today. It starts being what happens once two separate AI ecosystems start training the next generation of artificial intelligence side by side. One ecosystem is built on Nvidia and answers to Washington. The other is built on Huawei and answers to Beijing. That split is already happening right now. What we do not know yet is how far it goes. The ripple effect across the globe. Here is why this matters even if you never buy a chip in your life. Chinese AI lab DeepSeek grabbed global headlines by training a competitive AI model while working under real hardware constraints. They could not get the best Nvidia chips because of export restrictions, so they figured out how to do more with less, optimizing their software to run on domestic hardware instead. It relies on the same domestic chip ecosystem SMIC and Huawei are building out. There is also a chip maker called Cambricon. They are a smaller domestic rival to Huawei, and while they do not get as much attention, they are growing fast. In a single quarter, their revenue jumped past $400 million. That is a clear sign that this is not a one-company story. It is an entire industry rising at once. Startups, mid-sized companies, and giant corporations are all building pieces of this new supply chain. The ripple effect of this is huge. Every country now watching this standoff faces the same quiet decision Chinese companies already made. Countries across the Middle East and nations across Southeast Asia are all paying attention. They are building AI infrastructure right now, and they have to make a choice. They can build AI infrastructure on American chips with American software and American rules attached. Those rules can change at any time, as Nvidia's experience in China shows clearly. Or they can build on a Chinese alternative that is one generation behind, but improving every year and free from Washington's export list. 10 years ago, that was not really a choice at all. Nvidia was simply the only serious option on the table for anyone building real artificial intelligence. If you wanted to train AI models, you bought Nvidia, or you did not train AI models. Today, it is an actual decision with two real paths. That alone is the deeper story most people watching the flashy chip announcements are completely missing. The world is splitting into two different technology stacks. If you want American chips, you have to follow American rules. If you want Chinese chips, you get something a little slower, but with no strings attached. For many countries, that is an easy choice to make, especially if they have ever worried about being cut off the way China was. The global map of technology is being redrawn right now, and the lines are being drawn by who makes the chips. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. There are related videos on the screen right now if you want to keep watching. So here is a question for you. If you were in charge of building AI for a whole country, would you choose the faster chips with strict rules or the slower chips with no restrictions? Let me know in the comments.